So welcome and thank you everybody to Human Rights in City Hall. We have here with us today Nicki Ward, and my name is Christina. I'm from ProudPolitics. Very happy to have you all here today to talk about a variety of topics, all concerning municipal issues. I just want to begin today's session with a land acknowledgement. I believe it is very important for all of us to recognize our history with our Indigenous peoples, and for all of us, whether we are government employees or citizens, to make efforts for truth and reconciliation moving forward. The impacts of colonialization and residential schools are still felt by many Native Canadians, and the importance for reconciliation cannot be overstated. So that being said, Toronto, where ProudPolitics is based out of and where I'm hosting this webinar from, is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and the land. All subsequent Indigenous nations, including peoples, newcomers, Europeans, have all been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. A bit of an agenda and housekeeping for today. We're going to do a quick icebreaker for the group just to talk a bit about the municipal election and get excited for the phenomena that we're all going to be witnessing soon. Then I'm going to talk very briefly about ProudPolitics and what it is that we do, introduce our fabulous speaker, Nicki Ward, today, go straight into our discussion, and then we have an open Q&A period. So if you have any questions whatsoever throughout the discussion, feel free to raise your hand and I will unmute you, or put your question in the chat. You can also wait for the end when we have the open Q&A period. So whatever you are most comfortable doing, feel free. Just to note, you should all automatically be muted, just because we are trying to reduce the chance of the Zoom bomber interrupting our wonderful discussion today. So just to let you know, if you do want to talk, just feel free to raise your hand and I will be unmuting you. So just to get started, these are just 3 questions I have for the audience. So quickly to ask you all, the most important question of today: when are municipal elections happening? When do we all get a chance to do our civic duty and go out there and vote? Some of you know the answer. Some of you have been to our prior webinars and you know that I ask this question every time, but that just means every single person on this call should be getting the answer correctly. No shame for wrong answers, of course. We're here to learn. I do see only correct answers so far, so no pressure. Okay. I will give about 10 more seconds for those who haven't voted yet, but congratulations to everybody who knows. It is very important to be aware. Okay, so to end the poll and share the results, it is happening October 24th. Municipal elections are happening across Ontario and across Canada as well. So October 24th, make sure that you make it a day, plan ahead for it, find out what your local voting booth is, and do your civic duty to vote for your local city councillors. Another question that I have for you all today is, who is running for office? Who's going to be in our ballot? Like, what are we voting for during this election? So the question is out there. So let me know if you know, who are we voting for? The prime minister, the premier, mayor. Only correct answer so far. That means you've either come to previous webinars or you're politically informed. I'm happy with both answers. But yes, thank you. So about 5 more seconds. Okay. And just sharing the results with you all, majority of you got the answer correct. We are voting for the mayor, city councillors, and school board trustees. The last one I feel like is one that some people might forget about, that our school boards are also, our trustees are also running in this election. So now we have a chance to vote for people who will have a direct impact on the different school boards we have in Toronto and all of our students as well. And now one final question, this will not be in a poll. Who here can tell me what is advanced voting? A term that hopefully everyone has heard about, but maybe not everybody knows exactly about. Anyone? Okay, Nicki, go ahead, take it away. Can you tell us a bit about advanced voting?
Who, me?
Yes.
Yeah, well, for us, the election starts as soon as the advanced polls open, because people are now voting earlier than ever and there are more opportunities to vote. People tend to come out, if they've made their mind up, to vote during the advanced polls, which I think, if I remember, in the city of Toronto are from the October 7th through the 14th. So those are extra voting days as opposed to waiting to the end. And if for people who want to avoid maybe some of the crowds, that's an opportunity for them to do that as well.
Perfect answer. So yes, exactly as you just mentioned, it is October 7th to 14th. So for those who don't think they'll be available on a Monday, October 24th, or will have work or prior engagements, make sure to go to advanced voting days and show up to your local voting booth as you would regularly. As long as you vote, doesn't really matter which days, as long as it is one of the available days. And for those of you who want to vote from the comfort of your own home, mail-in voting applications for that have already opened. So you can call the number for elections or go on the website and they'll mail your ballot will be mailed to your door. So you can do that as well now, even before advanced voting days start. And as we already mentioned, you're voting for your mayor, you're voting for city councilors, and you're voting for school board trustees. So there's 3 different levels of political awareness that we are all responsible for so that we can make an informed decision. So next, just very briefly to talk a bit about ProudPolitics. Some of you, I mean, most of you are already aware about who we are and what we do because you've come here. But our goal is mainly to diversify the face and voice of Canada's politics. How do we do that? We bring attention to their campaigns. We look for queer candidates that are running. We bring attention to their platforms and give them almost like a spotlight for them to be able to share their incredible ideas. We host webinars like this to be able to educate people and have these important discussions about different issues that are happening locally, provincially, federally. We host candidate training sessions when we have a chance. We do community outreach as well as collaborations. We do have a website, proudpolitics.org, if you want to look at more information or looking to get involved. And if you are interested in knowing about all the queer candidates that are running in different elections, if you go to proudpolitics.org/candidates, you will be able to see all the incredible queer candidates that we have come across that we want to share with you, so you know, are they running in my riding? Can I vote for this candidate? And you will have access to be able to get involved with their campaigns, look at their policies. So if that interests you, it's all on our website. And today we are so lucky to have a wonderful speaker with us here today, Nicki Ward. Thank you so much for being able to join us today and for your time. A bit about Nicki Ward. Nicki has spent decades of her life towards advocacy and improving rights for all kinds of different spheres. She has worked in areas of like LGBTQ, disability, human rights, community. She has experience being in executive boards as well as in the private and public sector. She led the reform of the Canadian Constitution and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. She's a leader in housing, community, disability, gender, and all kinds of advocacy. She's changed policy and legislation in all levels of government. She's also an expert in science, technology, and financial communications. So really knowledgeable candidate on all sides and really a candidate for all constituents. Also a proud parent and an equity-seeking candidate. For so many reasons, we're so lucky to have you here today, and we're so excited to talk about all these important discussions and be able to sort of shed light about what are some of the key topics happening in this election and how is it the City Hall really works when it comes to a lot of rights-based issues. So we can just sort of get started, get right into it. And if anybody has questions at any point, as I mentioned, just feel free to pop them in the chat, questions or comments, or you can wait till the end. Just please feel free to raise your hand and I can call on you as well. So my first question, Nicki, you're so accomplished. You've done so many different things in your life, all very inspirational. You've also run for office for multiple levels of government. So I guess first thing I want to ask you is, can you share with us a bit about which elections you participated in? And just in general, what motivates you to seek elected office? Oh, I'm really sorry, you're on mute.
I have a technical question, which is, are we all looking at a thing that says discussion time, or what are we looking at here?
Yes, we're looking at discussion time, but I can stop that now because we can just have a regular discussion here and then everyone is welcome to join.
Very good, very good. I will say also in the background, I have the chat screen open, so if people have things that come up as we go through, we can do this somewhat organically. So firstly, let me begin by saying thank you. Thank you. I've been a fan and engaged with ProudPolitics for, well, almost as long as I think it's been around. I did engage in some of the early candidate training, the outreach, and in several elections I've been listed and supported as a candidate by ProudPolitics, a genuinely non-partisan organization that is really trying to broaden the number of people we see running for office, and of course, eventually winning the chance to serve the people with their particular lens. As was mentioned before, I'm an equity-seeking candidate, which is difficult because obviously, first and foremost, I'm clearly a member of the LGBTQ community. And in politics, sometimes, we were saying before this started, that with identity politics, it sometimes there's a difference that clicks in when we're talking about the LGBTQ community. Whereas for regular groups, they will say a candidate who is male, a candidate who is female, a candidate who is a person of color. They'll do it in that order. But when we talk about a gay candidate, suddenly the identity, or a trans candidate like myself, who is also gay, they put a gay trans or queer trans candidate at the front of the sentence, which is in a way separates us from the mainstream in ways that are not helpful. So I identify as a servant of the community, someone engaged in community service who does have a number of intersections with equity-seeking areas. So I'm going to go into that right now. I'm open about most of them, not all of them, because some things are not anybody's business. But I'll begin by saying that I'm one of the few women running in this race. There aren't enough women in politics, and there aren't enough women running in the municipal elections here in Toronto in general. There are 9 candidates running in Toronto Centre, and there are only 2 women. That is not proportionate by any stretch of the imagination. And part of that is because of the institutional barriers that we all know about to people who are perceived to be of a minority, of the other. I'm also honored to be a trans woman, a member of the trans community. Much of my advocacy over the years has been related to that, so that I had a part to play in the changing of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms to include gender identity and gender expression, and again, we were talking about this beforehand. It's not a lot of people know that gender identity and gender expression was only included in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 2017, so 5 years ago. And we recently celebrated the 100-year anniversary of the first female politician, but we have yet to elect a trans woman to any level of parliamentary politics in Canada at all, ever, anyway, not just municipally, but provincially and federally. So we've got a pretty significant glass ceiling, if that's the right word, that we're about to break. We believe that in this particular riding, after 30 years of advocacy in the community and a certain amount of name recognition, that we have a real chance to make significant history in Canada and frankly in North America. So that's very exciting to be part of this broad team that's engaged in that. Another intersection for me is I'm a person with a disability. And again, I'm fortunate in that I get around, but as somebody with a disability, I'm acutely aware of the need for somebody. For example, we were talking before about the need to be able to see someone's lips, so that improves comprehension for those people who are not just deaf, but also member of the deaf community, but also people who are hard of hearing and may have other cognitive issues. So I'm a member of the disability community, as you might say. What other intersections? I'm an older person. Thank heavens I made it. A lot of my sisters who are trans women did not make it. So I'm honored to be a senior at this stage, although I will tell you, politics keeps you young. So for those of you who are entering the field, I encourage you to do so. So I'm an elder. What else do we have? I remember I'm proud to be in a relationship with another woman as a lesbian, and that's an important part of how I see the world and how I understand the world. And also, interestingly, somebody brought this up at a meeting the other day. It was very interesting. I'm a renter. And that is another interesting thing about people in politics. Many of them are property owners, and that creates a different, indeed, the first people who had political office in hundreds of years ago were only the landowners and the property owners. And so as a renter, I would be part of a minority there. It didn't cross my mind until somebody brought that up. So those are some of the areas that I intersect there. I don't think it's any secret that as somebody who has come out as a trans woman long before it was fashionable or even legal in some areas, I've experienced poverty, hardship, and because of that creates health issues, which include not just physical disabilities, which I've endured, but also mental health, because it's impossible to be segregated from society and not experience mental trauma because of that. So part of running for politics, part of remaining engaged, is to take those lived experiences and put them to good use and good purpose. And again, I've not become an advocate because I'm particularly, about sitting on a soapbox. I've become an advocate out of necessity because my friends, my chosen family, my community has needed somebody who is not prepared to put up with the status quo, and somebody who's prepared to stand up for human rights. And that's something I've got from my mother, who is still very much engaged in the political scene. And she was at the forefront of a woman's right to choose, which frankly, it's crazy we're revisiting that now. So it runs in the family. Sorry, a very long answer to your question, but hopefully that rounds out things in terms of where I'm coming from.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think you answered about your motivations very clearly, especially in politics, where, as you've already alluded to, like, not everybody has a seat at the table. Like you mentioned, it was mostly landlords and property owners who were in politics for a really long time. And
Sure.
now in like recent, decades, we're finally seeing representation increase from different minority groups. So thank you so much for running for office, because you alone as one individual bring so many voices and so many perspectives to the table from all the different identities that you represent as well.
Yes, that's
Um,
true.
yeah, I have a question also, because you were running in Ward 13. Ward 13 is Toronto Center. A lot of people in the chat and those who are here with us today, I know, are also in Toronto Center. It is a very diverse community. It is a very downtown and populated community. I just have a very quick poll that I want to ask our audience members here today. And then I have a question for Nicki, where I want to ask you, what changes do you want to make in Ward 13? So let me first ask the question to you guys. To those who are here with us today, have you been to Ward 13? Like, I am currently in Ward 13, but have you guys experienced for yourselves the Gay Village or Dundas Square, Toronto Metropolitan University, that area? So, you'll have a bit more of a experience about when we talk about these issues, you can see the environment and you already know like the areas that we're talking about. Okay, everyone so far has answered yes. I'm just going to end the poll here and share with you. It's nice to see so many people from Toronto Centre joining us here today for this discussion. And now to ask you, Nicki, as well, in Ward 13, if you were elected to represent the ward, what would be at the forefront of your agenda? What changes do you want to make to your ward specifically?
Well, the changes, the core character of our ward is marvelous. I came here 35 years ago and I literally fell in love. I mean, I felt it here. I'd come from the UK and traveled through Europe, and I was working at the time from the United States in the financial services sector, doing something very, very straight indeed. And I came here, and this you cannot imagine, unless as a newcomer to Canada, I've shared this with others, how incredibly amazing Toronto Centre is. It is diverse in every sense of the word. We've got rich people, we've got poor people, we've got business owners, we've got entrepreneurs, we've got LGBT pockets, we've got Corktown, St. Lawrence, multiple different communities, so vibrant, so culturally rich. And I would change none of that, because that's what makes Toronto special. The things I would change are the things that have happened since I've been here that have undermined that community, our community, and robbed us of some of those special qualities. And they're really, frankly, quite almost mundane and ordinary. That's not to say they're not very important, but they're intensely practical. There are right now, I've seen the character of Toronto Centre, the nature of how we've lived life change dramatically. I moved to the Toronto Centre because when I came out as trans, I couldn't rent anywhere because nobody would rent me. But in Toronto Centre, they would. I came here because although I'd enjoyed some privilege in my previous life, I was immediately unemployed, or I was put out on the streets. I lost my house, my home. I lost access to my family. And all of those things were provided to me by working and growing and living in Toronto Centre. And all of those are right now jeopardized because we have appalling levels of homelessness. And although Toronto Centre has some of the richest people in the country, it also has some of the poorest people in the country who are not being helped, who have been abandoned by, quite frankly, the rest of Toronto. We have homelessness, underhousing, people who are right on the edge of subsistence living. And we also have people who are suffering the profound effects of mental health and addiction here in Toronto Centre. We have the bulk of the City of Toronto's problems. And by the way, people with mental health and addiction issues aren't a problem. They are people who have challenges in their life that need to be dealt with sensibly. There's a lot of talk about mental health is real health, but is it really? There's still so much stigma attached to it. And so if we had a bunch of people in Toronto Centre, let's say, for example, all had diabetes, we'd be getting insulin, we'd get better training, better diet, we'd be on that like crazy. But somehow, because these are mental health things, we don't rush to it with the same level of support. People either sit on the sidelines and wring their hands and say, what can you do? What can you do? Or they wag a finger of shame and blame. So mental health and addiction, which I see hand in hand, the sense of despair, the lack of hope, that is something that needs to be worked on and fixed immediately. And the other thing that comes out of this is because of the sense of desperation that is prevalent, and we see it, because of that sense of desperation, we also see physical safety compromised. One of the things I loved about living in the gay ghetto was that you could go out at any time of the day and night, and you might see a few unusual things going on with people who liked each other very, very much and were enjoying each other's company. But you would always feel safe. You would always feel, and it was not just about feeling safe, it was about genuinely being safe. That has changed. And we are seeing more fences going up around communities. We are seeing people in shelters who look as if they're being caged. We have people on the streets who are struggling, clearly struggling with mental health crisis and acting out in difficult ways, either harmful to themselves or harmful to others. And those are not being addressed. They are being ignored, and they're being used like a political football. So the key things that I would like to see, I will see addressed. The election is October 24th, October 25th. This is what we will start doing, is bringing in practical solutions to some of these problems. Some of these issues are deep-seated and require long-term work. But some of these respond to triage. If you're familiar with the term, where you have an emergency situation, a crisis, and you have to evaluate on how to serve people based on the needs that they have, to triage. That's not happening right now, and that's exactly what we're going to fix. We have a full policy platform. Actually, no, I'll pop the link in the chat. We have a full policy platform that breaks down these things on a line item by line item basis. But the key three that we have to deal with immediately: housing and homelessness, mental health and addiction, and safety for all, everybody.
I just put the link to your policies on your website in the chat. So if anybody wants to look that over, that would be wonderful.
Cool.
You've touched on a lot in your answer. I love the things that you don't want to change, and I fully support the things you do want to change. I think I absolutely agree. There's a lot of contrast in downtown Toronto because there's so much diversity. There is a lot of class contrast, and I sometimes it bothers me when I hear a lot of people say, oh no, yeah, I support, for users and those struggling with addictions, yeah, they should have access to services. Oh, but I don't want a safe injection site, next to where I live. Like, yeah, I support it, but not in my backyard. And you can't have it one way or another. You either want to help people, or you are, acting in your self-interest, and you don't want to help people who need help. So in an area like Toronto Centre, everything is your backyard. You're sharing this whole community space, you're sharing downtown. So I absolutely agree with all of your points. And just to ask you a bit more specifically, when you are talking about all these different issues, especially like the mental health issues that are happening and the human rights issues that are happening in downtown Toronto, what would you say is the power or the jurisdiction that City Hall has on a municipal level to ensure that constituents have like access to human rights, have like services accessible to them, and to sort of have all these services realized for it to be accessible to everybody who needs it?
Great question. Great question. I mean, I will say that I was proud, honored to be part of the team that changed the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada. There is nothing more difficult than changing the constitution of a country. It requires teamwork. It requires working across party lines. And I will tell you that the trans women that I worked with did not have money or authority or power. We had the power of being on the right side of history. It may sound corny, but we were right and society was wrong. And we were focused, laser focused. Just because we were trans women, just because many of us had disabilities and indeed traumatized by the fact that we were routinely excluded from society, does not mean that we couldn't be effective in our advocacy and bring other allies to the table. It took us at least 12 years, 3 cycles of federal government to do it, and a lot of hard work. But if we can change that without actually being elected to office, well, then imagine what we can do if we're actually in office as well. There are 2 things that you have in any political position, one of which is legislative authority. You can change the rules. Well, it's already against the law to discriminate against trans people, to discriminate against people of color, but it still happens. So legislation doesn't stop everything. It's against the law to speed, but we see people, breaking the speed limit all the time. The second thing that one has, and this is probably the most important one that's important to me and why I'm running in Toronto Centre, is the power of office. So you have legislative authority and the power of office. And the power of office means that you can get people to the table to have a discussion. We joked about it before. Toronto thinks it's the center of the universe. It isn't, but it does have a disproportionate platform from which one can make particular points. And Toronto Centre, as the center of Toronto, it's not, but it has that sense, that huge authority that can be brought to the table. I helped the City of Toronto write their policy on building authentic spaces. And that platform at the municipal level was mirrored at the provincial level and then mirrored at the federal level. And by the way, that was mirrored by people of all political stripes, not just conservatives, not just NDP, not just Liberal, not just Greens, everybody. There is such a thing as a Canadian value. It may be a bit murky and vague, and maybe we say please too much, but the fact is that most Canadians believe in the idea of fairness. And if something is expressed as fair, good for everybody, good for Canada, good for Toronto, then that idea can be moved forward. Our position on trans rights wasn't that being good to trans people was morally the right thing to do, although that was part of it. What we said as well is that there are so many great, amazing, particularly trans women who really got the short end of the stick, amazing trans women who could be doing so much more if only we were allowed to. And that was a compelling argument. That, and showing people that we weren't monstrous, maybe a little bit different, maybe a little unusual. I'll never be a size 0, for example, but we were just neighbors who would help shovel snow in a snowstorm, who felt it was important to have safe spaces for our kids, I showed my dog there, who owned pets, who took care of things, and who were good neighbors to be around. And that really helped carry things forward. So municipal politics, small though it may be, is a way where you can have an enormous influence on the rest of Canada and how things are done in the future.
No, great point. And just to touch on that last bit, especially like what happens in a municipal can definitely impact what happens provincially and federally. The main reason why Canada has such a wonderful and sort of comprehensive healthcare system that is, free for all the basic things. Yeah, anyways, it all started in Saskatchewan with like their government almost 50, 60 years ago, where they put in that sort of policy framework, and the federal government loved it so much that they chose to implement a national scale. So no matter where the policy starts, it can absolutely influence greater change on a greater level. So yeah, no, thank you so much for sharing that. We talked a bit about housing. You mentioned yourself, your struggles with housing, and I think many of us in the call today can also relate that finding housing, and especially affordable housing and adequate housing that meets your needs, and sort of in this sort of political climate and this sort of housing bubble, is just near impossible. And all the mayoral candidates, as well as many city councillors, a lot of them are putting forward, yourself included, putting together sort of platform promises and initiatives to help Canadians and Torontonians, especially with housing, to create affordable housing, invest in affordable housing units. So especially with the housing crisis as it is right now, could you tell us a little bit about what degree of power City Council in Toronto has over the crisis? Like, what type of initiatives can city councillors invest in or implement to address the crisis?
Well, we have an enormous amount of power if we choose to exercise it as the councillor. There's much talk of this strong mayor policy coming in. What that calls for is a strong councillor. In the city of Toronto, a ward like Ward 13, Toronto Centre, has 110,000 residents in it. The budget is measured in millions, hundreds of millions of dollars. In fact, the city budget is just shy of $15 billion. So we're talking about enormous responsibility and the need to have very, very strong levels of compassion, but also strong management skills. And I'm very blessed to have had both. The thing, when it comes to housing, we have the biggest landlord in Toronto is Toronto. Toronto Community Housing Corporation owns an enormous amount of land and properties, which it fails to administer properly. If Toronto, the landlord, would actually get its act together, more than enough housing for everyone, but it doesn't, for a variety of reasons, some of which are management based. I'm honored to be on the executive of City Park Co-op, which is the largest co-op in Ontario. It's one of the largest in North America. Co-ops are the ideal blend of housing. They are environmentally sustainable. They are economically sustainable, and they are socially sustainable. The magic triangle that makes for a solid solution. We have a solution right now, community-led, community-driven housing, where we the people participate as our own landlords in a way. Not like a condo corporation, but where we share as members responsibility for operating this participatory housing. It's very, and we have stopped, the City of Toronto has stopped doing that. Instead, it's thrown more energy, more land, more broken buildings to the same organization. So in our very, very detailed housing policy, these aren't promises. These are actions that have history behind them as being proven to actually work. So there are a number of buildings right now that the TCHC, Toronto Community Housing Corporation, is completely incapable of managing. What we're saying, what our team is saying, there are people standing by. Buildings right now, like City Park Co-op, like in St. Lawrence, all across the Toronto Centre, that would be able to adopt properties and very rapidly turn those into co-op properties. This serves two things. Number one, it immediately takes some of that burden out of the city and gets we the people involved in the running of our own housing. And number two, by doing that, Toronto Community Housing could focus on doing what it should be doing already, which is maintain its existing properties or turning them into co-ops elsewhere. This is a solution that's been demonstrated to work over and over again, and yet it's been completely abandoned. So that's a key area for us. Let's separate that out. In another sense, we also need to look at housing differently. And again, this is something that can be done quickly. It won't solve everything overnight, but it will solve a lot of the problems right now. Current shelter systems, by the way, when I worked at the 519 for 25 plus years, I went into shelters. I did trainings to help people get along with folks like me or who were in there. I talk about inclusion at the shelter level. But shelters right now are being operated not much better than prisons, cages for containing people regardless of their needs. And so our current shelters are filled with vulnerable people who are being preyed upon by other vulnerable people who are traumatized. If you're trying to get better from mental health and addiction, you need a safe space to do that, but there are no safe spaces. If you're a person with a disability or an elder, you can't be around young people who may be mugging you or shaking you down for money because of their own desperate needs. There needs to be caring space for them as well. kids, LGBT kids, people who are just, maybe we can keep them out of the shelter system just because they maybe run away from home or whatever. These are vulnerable people that are put in the same cage, the same boxes as everybody else. We've got to stop doing that. No wonder people are forced to live in parks and public spaces, because it's fundamentally unsafe in a lot of these spaces. Who can blame a kid who's like, you know, a queer kid who's run away from up north somewhere, or hell, even somewhere in Toronto, because bigotry isn't just up north. There's plenty of it right here. Who can blame that kid for sleeping rough in a doorway in a park? Who can blame them if the shelters are so hostile, so unsafe for vulnerable people? And so we really need to massively rethink very, very quickly our shelter system that discriminates, that re-victimizes people who are already in very vulnerable state. That's something we can do right now. Right now. There's more on the site, but those are a couple of two things right there. Participatory housing, and stop this madness putting everybody in a bucket and think it'll be okay, because we can't. Clearly that's not working.
Mhm. The one thing I really want to highlight in your answer is that I think a lot of people, especially those who come from a place of privilege too, like they think of housing and we think, oh my God, getting a mortgage is so difficult and rent is so expensive. But I love how you've highlighted that it goes like beyond that. It's not just about, you know, finding a place to rent and finding a place to own. It's about finding a place, period, you know, especially like for Toronto's like really large unhoused population. Like it starts at the level of shelters. And I think your solution of cooperative housing, like it being socially responsible and sort of economically beneficial as well, like having that whole magical trifecta, as you were saying, I think that's such a wonderful solution. And I think like it's a really great idea that I think could definitely like benefit Toronto, as well as, you know, it's the residents that are struggling the most to find housing.
It's not even a new idea. We started out in the 70s and it was working for some reason. People stopped doing it, you know, madness that we stopped doing. This isn't a new, untested, crazy, loopy idea. This is something we did before works, and there's no reason why it can't work again. So catch you up there, carry on.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I just put this in the chat as well, but like, I think the reason why maybe the idea has lost popularity, especially among like some career politicians who, you know, they like putting profit over people has become almost like commonplace in some levels of politics, where, you know, instead of thinking about the most vulnerable communities first, you just try to think which idea is going to benefit, you know, the people who are actually going to vote for me. You know, many unhoused people, you know, don't have a chance to vote, because even being able to dedicate that time to go vote and to be able to go, like even that is like a level of privilege. So if the unhoused community are not voters per se, or not like a large group of voters, they're often overlooked, like their needs.
Yeah, I mean, your point's really well made there. I was having a conversation. You talk about the right in voting system, and we've heard a lot of concerns from people saying it's very difficult to navigate that. And you're absolutely right. You know, people who are underhoused or living rough, what have you, don't have access to Wi-Fi, don't have a little laptop that they can port around, or nip into a Starbucks and get their free, you know, free Wi-Fi there. It's just not pragmatic. And then the other thing that happens, and I've experienced this firsthand, was, you know, I'm pleased to say that I'm competent. I'm physically, knock on wood, physically healthy with some disability, but basically physically healthy and basically mentally healthy. But there was a time, particularly when I first came out and my world came crashing down, that I didn't have the wherewithal to talk as hopefully articulately as I'm talking today. I didn't have money. I completely overnight became a second and third class citizen. And the fact is that I can't put myself, we were talking again earlier today with a co-op group, not City Park, but another big one down the road here. If you want to get on the housing list, all you have to do is go to a website, give them your email address, and then when a housing becomes available, they will email you. What madness is this? Some poor person on the side of a street can't be constantly checking their email or have a, you know, a data plan on their phone. That's not how it works. So that's hard coding discrimination into the system. So then there are people who are traumatized, who may have strong language skills under normal conditions, but are so traumatized or suffering from a host of other mental health issues that they can't do that. And then you have language issues over and above that. My goodness, no wonder the homeless population or the underhoused population includes so many people who are also discriminated against on the other basis. It's baked into the process. And I have to tell you that in the private sector, we used to work in the insurance industry, and the business we did was, a lot of it was with newcomers to Canada. And so we made sure that the information we provided in the private sector was in their language and in a language that made sense to them. And that if they wanted to talk to somebody on customer service, that we had somebody that spoke Eritrean or Ethiopian or not just the mainstream languages. So it's not even the businesses know that this is smart business, and yet we don't do this with the City of Toronto. We continue to have these systems where it's baked in discrimination, and then suddenly, somebody at City Hall says, "I don't know why this is going on. How come there are so many people with mental health issues that can't access housing?" Well, if you make it functionally impossible to access it, what else is going to happen? And this is the kind of logic, plain speaking. This isn't blaming anybody. It's just the kind of institutional incompetence that kind of creeps in if you don't have good management in the form of a councillor who can say, the story, the emperor has no clothes, right? Somebody who can point out once you see that, you can't unsee it. You can't unknow the fact that the system to access housing is impossible for people who are living the streets to access. You can't unknow that, and then you can't ignore that at a later stage, particularly if there's somebody with, red hair and maybe a little bit of an attitude, friendly but firm, to actually constantly remind you that this is what we're supposed to be doing.
No, thank you. No, absolutely. I think it is the role of an elected representative to act in the interests of those that they represent, especially those who are most vulnerable. It's not about, reducing red tape for you or for the wealthier class, or about focusing on those interests. It's about helping those who need the help the most, as opposed to just that large majority. So thank you with all of your answers. I think Toronto Centre would be so lucky to have you as a candidate to be able to give that voice to those marginalized communities. Just to shift gears just a little bit, another marginalized community that services can often be hard to access are the persons with disabilities in Toronto as well. And I was just wondering what your thoughts were about what the municipal government can do to improve accessibility to services for the disabled community, and how they can make these services better, how they can meet the needs of the community more effectively.
Again, another great question. We've got a thing on accessibility. Let's begin with the notion of, let's just dismiss the idea of disability as a notion altogether, and let's talk about accessibility. Because if you have poor vision, then something that is easy to read for somebody with poor vision is also easy to read if you don't have poor vision. Something that is written in plain language to help people with cognitive difficulties is good for them, but it's also good for the rest of us who maybe, some of this stuff is incomprehensible. So clear language for those, good design, good accessibility that's baked into the process is by definition good for those with disabilities. I was talking with a friend about a new shelter in place where they're going to say 15% of the space will be for people with disabilities. Well, no. 100% of the space should be accessible all the time, period. Let's face it, the population is getting older, and if we're lucky, we get older, but sometimes we have issues with health and so forth. So why would you build a new building where only a small percentage of the building could be used for the future benefit of all? If you design it to be accessible, at the outset, not only is it better, but it's cheaper to do this. So accessibility includes the ability of people to get around safely in the city. Right now, with the massive amounts of construction that's going on, people with poor visibility, poor mobility, wheels of some kind or another, whether it's a walker or a wheelchair, simply cannot get around from point A to point B. But then neither can a mum with a baby carriage or an older person with their shopping. So it's not about making the sidewalk wider for the few people who need it, but making the sidewalk wider and consistently accessible, even when there's construction going on, for everybody. Now, one of the ways to do this, I have some amazing friends who are engaged in disability activism. And one of the things I propose to do as the councillor is to engage these amazing volunteer groups and have those eyes and ears on the street and employ them for an honorarium to help supplement the completely inadequate ODSP or what have you. Employ them with the councillor's office as a flying squad to go and report on the councillor's behalf or on all of our behalf to transportation or parks and recreation or whoever is messing up and say, hey, I can't get my wheelchair through there right now. That's something you can't unsee. When somebody who is visually impaired says, I ran into that street sign because you hung it at the wrong level. I nearly got run over because the signaling, the audio signaling doesn't work. I nearly got run over because my wheelchair got stuck in a rut and I couldn't get out, or because of the sand. And those people in the face, the people at City Hall aren't bad, but aren't enough people there to fact check what's going on. The plan on paper may be beautiful, but we've all been down the streets right now where we can see the construction is all over the place. There's not a proper ramp. The traffic isn't redirected properly. It's about the execution. And so using those extra set of eyes and ears and people as a quality control to make sure that their standards are met benefits all of us. Because the truth is, a construction site that is well set up is also safe for the workers that are working on it, if the fences aren't right. And that the trickle-down effect to the rest of the city is so positive and productive. By making it accessible for all, the trickle-down effect is really profound. I mean, consider this. Getting from one part of Toronto to another right now is an exercise in futility. Emergency services, for example, their response times are going down, 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 because they simply cannot get an ambulance or a police services or EMS services from point A to point B. And so having built-in accessibility, demanding that the beautiful plans that we see at the presentation match the actual reality of the situation helps with that. I think this is a win-win situation. It's not just the right thing to do. It's economically sustainable, the same triangle. It's environmentally sustainable, it's economic sustainable, and of course, it's socially sustainable. It's part of our whole philosophy behind what we're doing here.
Yeah, I just put that quote in the chat as well. For meaningful results can only be achieved if they're environmentally, socially, and economically sustainable. That sort of trifecta.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. And thank you so much for making that very valid point that accessibility really does benefit everybody. During the pandemic, we saw a lot of government services being offered online. We saw education being transformed online. And of course, there's different opinions, about the efficacy of all of these different things. But ultimately, having that extra option, an alternative to having to go in person, benefited everybody, not just people who had, some issues with mobility, but also people who, did not want to pay massive transit costs or commuting costs, gas prices, all these different things. So definitely accessibility benefits more than, like you mentioned, the few people, it really is something that benefits everybody. So thank you so much for that answer. I actually have a question for the audience, and I just want to quickly ask you guys, and then we can launch into more of a general Q&A if you guys have any questions for Nicki specifically as well. But I am just sort of curious, just going to launch. So political engagement is something that is really a hot topic in, I guess, political science in general, because so many researchers are always wondering, how do people get involved in office? Sometimes not everybody is voting, because, especially youth. There's really low voter turnouts in youth. If you don't know already, this past Ontario election was the lowest voter turnout in provincial history. So I just want to have a general question. This should be a multiple choice, so feel free to select multiple answers if possible. How have you been engaged in politics? How do people, who are present with us today? Okay, I see almost every single one getting involved, which is wonderful. Yeah, so we have people who have selected political campaigns, having a political job, go in a political webinar discussion, which I will say all of you can now press yes, because this counts. Wonderful. Voting in an election, that's wonderful. Voice your political opinion online. yeah, and I did find others. So if you have something that I did not list there, it was just some examples, feel free to put in the chat about how you involved yourself politically outside of like the options given. Okay, I'm just going to share the results with you all. So yes, going to a webinar is the most popular options. I wonder why. But yeah, thank you all so much for getting involved politically. The point of this poll, what I really wanted to highlight is that there's multiple ways of getting involved in politics. And I think almost every single person can find frustration in politics in one way or another, or dissatisfaction, maybe even some anger. And so the final question I have for Nicki before we open the floor to questions for everybody here is that what advice would you give to Canadians who are angry with politics or disappointed? Not everyone considers running for office themselves because there's a lot of barriers to running for office, obviously. But do you believe that running for office is like maybe the superior way of getting involved? Or do you think there are other ways that constituents should get involved to make an impact in their communities?
Well, there's an old maxim, from each according to their means, to each according to their needs. We need, if whatever you can do, I think we are obliged to do. I'm fortunate in that I've had some training and in, for example, the business community that gives me sort of an idea of how things can be managed. I've also had experience in communication and communicating complex ideas. Part of what I did in financial management and also in technology was communicate some of these more complicated ideas to make them more accessible to other people. There is no small level of participation in politics. The worst thing we already seen is that people do not vote. We sadly, we suspect that in this municipal election, even fewer people will turn out than for the provincial. And that's completely backwards, because your opportunity to influence change is greater at the municipal level than it is at the federal level. You can actually talk to your councillor. You can't necessarily talk to the Prime Minister. The other thing is that active engagement means encouraging others to vote, of course, and encouraging others to be informed. The problem we have here is an absence of hope. There's an absence of sense that we can't do anything. That kind of lethargy gets translated over to City Hall. We need to let City Hall know that, particularly in Toronto Centre, that there are people here who will come out and vote, make a nuisance of themselves if government doesn't do its job. For those who are on the right now, it's amazing how there's this thing I said to you, there's a give me a lever long enough and a place to set it and I will move the world. All of you on here are in a very high leverage situation. By participating in a campaign, by helping raise donations or fundraising, by volunteering, by knocking on a few doors, you can do an enormous amount. I mean, a completely disproportionate to how important you might think you are. When we started changing things at the federal level, we were just people who were fed up, you know, and we just wouldn't accept, you know, some things, there are some kind of up with which you cannot put, right? We said we are not prepared to accept the status quo. Not everybody could do everything, but everybody did a little bit. When we did the first march on Yonge Street with the trans community, people said we didn't exist. We got 15,000 people out on the street because people were saying trans women didn't exist. And we did that with the help of marvelous people like the Bike Pirates, beautiful, beautiful anarchists who help us print T-shirts, and people who had no money, people on OW and ODSP, photocopying or maybe pinching a few photocopies from places to photocopy pictures to put up on lampposts so that people would come up. There's no small level of engagement. Never think that you don't count. What you do is incredibly important.
That is really good advice. And I completely agree with you about the hopelessness. I think there's a lot of barriers to participating and being aware politically. And I definitely think hopelessness is one of them. Another one is time. I think there's a lot of, it does take time to be politically engaged and to dedicate the time to be able to go out there and vote or come to a webinar like this, even if it is an hour or so of your time. So definitely, I think as city councillors, there's a lot of things that people can do to reduce the barriers to political engagement. Like if there was, for example, like a national paid holiday where people did not have to work to be able to go, something like that, you know, would eliminate the barrier of time because people would not be sort of quote unquote wasting time. You know, they would still be able to have their wage while also going to vote and do their civic duty. Yeah, absolutely. And then people would maybe also feel more hopeful about voting as well, because it's a national holiday. So it'll become hopefully a more unified thing that everybody sort of takes pride in.
I think voting is a civic duty. There are different opinions about, proportional representation. In Australia, however, they view voting as a civic duty, like jury duty or anything else, and that voting is mandatory. And that eliminates a lot of the the get out the vote elements, because everybody has to vote. And then, since you have to vote, you have to do your homework. Well, that's the other thing. Doing a little bit of homework, really does pay dividends here. So, and I'm really interested to see what other people have or questions, what they have. So I'll try and stop yakking now and start listening a bit better.
Does anybody have questions for our speaker today, Nicki Ward? I do also post in the chat links to our social media and our website. So if anybody has questions that come up after, feel free to message Nicki herself. We have a question for Arthur. So I'm just gonna unmute you.
Thank you, Christina. Hi, Nicki. Always
Hi,
great
Arthur.
to hear from you, and thank you so much for coming to join us. And great to hear your accomplishments and your story as well. So my question is, going back to your time when you were contemplating to run for office as an out transgender woman, what hesitations did you have, and how did you kind of overcome those concerns? And I ask this because I'm sure there's a lot of openly LGBTQ leaders who are contemplating running for office and are going through similar kind of reflections that you might have had in the past.
Well, at the risk of pandering, I have to say that ProudPolitics has really helped in that regard, because I'm not quite sure how long you guys have been around, but I do remember visiting with you guys when we were still, before we got the gender identity bill passed. And so having some sort of mutual support around that was really, 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 it wasn't just about the practical ideas, because a lot of us had some political experience before in other lives. It was about that sense of mutual support. But I think, I think just believing that there was never, I'm running right now, not because I want to run, but because I feel I have to run. And that sounds, that's not, it may sound odd to say that, but everything I've done is because it's been morally and spiritually imperative to do that. Many of us in the LGBTQ, we fought for the right to live authentically. It would have been easier for a trans woman to have stayed in the closet and have enjoyed maybe some extra privilege because of that. But it was an existential thing. I couldn't live any way other than who and what I am. My purpose in life is to live a full and useful life. I say to those folks who are in the LGBT community, who actually who are out, really have maybe a bit of a leg up on this one, because we've already sacrificed a lot to live authentically. I'm not about to go back in the closet. Roe versus Wade is scary, because a woman's right to choose, many people thought, myself, because I remember before Roe versus Wade, that women's rights were permanent. They're not. For now, we have trans rights in Canada. They're not permanent. They're only sustained based on us demanding the right to live authentically. And for me, that's an existential thing. I don't know any other way to live. I don't fight for the sake of it. I fight because it's the right thing to do. And I don't know how to find that sense. There have been times when we all feel it, a sense of, can I go on? How am I going to get the energy to do this? But we are blessed in many ways, because we have come out, we have found that living authentically, we can find love and acceptance. And that is the same is true in the political community. It's a little harder in the political community, because we do run into the same things that we run into other employment areas, where people say, I'm not biased, but I'm not convinced the time is right for a trans woman to be a councillor in Toronto. I'm not bigoted, but we have to think about, how foolish electors are. My experience has been that regular straight electors are plenty smart enough to figure out who is a good person to vote for and who isn't. At the end of the day, we do have this thing of fairness. Sorry, it's a super question. I wish I had a smarter answer than that, but that's my answer. I've done it. I do it because I have to do it. And yeah, that's it.
Oh, I think it's a fabulous answer. Like there's a quote like, they walked so we could run. And I think that sort of applies to the situation too. Like, it's always hard for the first of something, the one who is like breaking that glass ceiling, metaphorically. But then afterwards, there is no ceiling to break for the next generation coming in, because when that representation is, oh, yeah. So there's a person in the chat who also said, we stand on the shoulders of giants. So thank you for being, our giants,
Well, that's very gracious. Regrettably, there's always somebody to come in and maybe replace the glass. So, so we have to keep at it. And again, I got to say thank you to everybody who's participated here. There's a question here: what did politicians do on a day-to-day basis? Is that worth just? Do we have a moment to talk about that, or we're running a little? We're running a little. I don't want to impose on other people's time. Politicians, much of what politicians do, good politicians, mind you, do, is not obvious. As I said earlier, legislation, changing the law is part of it. I mean, I had a part to change the law of Canada so that it is illegal to discriminate against people on the basis of gender identity or gender expression, but that still happens. So you can't just change the law. You have to change people's minds, change people's behaviors. Some of that work is very subtle, and it takes place behind the scenes. When we were changing the gender identity rules, we talked with conservatives, some of whom had kids who were trans but couldn't come out about it, some of whom may indeed have been trans themselves. And so a lot of politics is about influencing the power of office. And again, a good politician will get people in the same room at the same time. We'll get people from the CHFT, which is the Canadian, the co-op, Toronto cooperative groups, get them in the same room as the people who are in housing in the city of Toronto, and maybe the mayor, and maybe even somebody from the province, from another party, that Ministry of Housing and municipalities. Getting those people in the same room at the same time. On paper, we may disagree with a lot of things, but most people, not everybody, but most people go into politics because they like to see the world a better place. And if you can get them in the same room and find an idea that is economically sustainable for the conservatives, environmentally sustainable for those of us who care about the planet, and socially sustainable, you get those things together, then a lot of people will say, yeah, we got co-ops during a time of relative conservatism in Canada. So it's not impossible to do that, but a lot of it happens behind the scenes. There's another question here about emotional issues here. The question is emotionally laborious. Yeah, very discouraging. How do you not burn out and not back down over the years? Well, sometimes I have burned out and I have had to take a break and back out. I will tell you that a kind word along the way really helps. Thank you for the question, by the way. Kind words help. Remember that we are maybe, that there's constant reminders for kindness. I will tell you that my partner in life is somebody without whom I could not exist, and having a loving family, a new discovered family, has been really, really helpful. When I was at the 519 doing trainings in shelters, often being brutalized, often hearing terrible language, and many of my colleagues not making it, suiciding because of vicarious trauma or lateral violence, I got a little bit smart about that and made sure that I engaged in a lot of self-care and laughing easily at myself and others, and trying to have compassion for even people who are on the wrong side of history and the wrong side of the decision making. The other thing, to answer your question, is it helps to have a few successes under your belt. I lived in a time when people would look me directly in the face and say, trans women don't exist. I'm here. How could you say we don't exist? And then showing up and embarrassing the people by having 15,000 people on Yonge Street. Being proven right really helps. Getting a few wins under your belts really, really helps. But yeah, really good question. Really good question. Don't know if that's the right answer. That's all I got for that.
Oh, another question in the chat. Feel free to read it out loud, Nicki, if you would like, and then answer.
Well, thank you for the kind remarks there, Elio. My experience has been, I remember when we were doing there are a lot of talking about identity politics, right? On my YouTube channel, we've got stuff going back years and years and years, interviews with City, Breakfast City, and on a whole host of issues. And one of the things I learned very early on, in the early days, was that people are looking for fairness in Canada. Even people who disagree with the choice to be gay or lesbian or trans, how could you, the choice, as if it is indeed a choice. And what I've done in those environments, and some of those I'm really more proud of than others, and subtle, is going on TV and saying, you know what? I'm talking about education, for example, sex education. In one of the interviews, I have kids, and I was interviewed, and they're expecting me to get all, I don't know what they're expecting. And I said, you know what? I want my kids to get the best information so they can make the best decisions for themselves. Growing up, I didn't have that. And like as a parent, I care about the safety of my kids. I care that education is based on facts, not opinions, right? And as a parent, that's important to me. Now that sounds basic, but I got to tell you, I had a lot of smart people behind me, with me, helping craft that message. Not you're a bigoted, not you, but you're a bigoted person for even bringing it up and saying that we shouldn't have fully comprehensive sex education, but instead turning that into a message of an authentic message, to use your language, and if possible, and it sounds kind of a bit hippy dippy to say this, but if not loving, at least compassionate. And so the best work that I've ever done as a trans advocate or as an advocate in general, human rights, disability, police, whatever, has been where I've said, hey, our point of view is rational, is caring, is sustainable, is good for people, it's good for the economy. It's not craziness. This is just common sense. You don't want police that beat other people up for no apparent reason. Nobody wants that. That's not smart. And that's a very, very different discussion. It's more nuanced, but by heavens, it changes a lot of minds. A number of calls I got from people after that thing saying, oh, I get it. Oh, I get it, And that's part of our job, to communicate. We have to meet people sometimes more than halfway, right? And talk to them with compassion and love. So anyway, yeah, I try to be authentic. And circling back to that question about how do you not burn out, to thine own self be true, therefore let no one call thee false, right? Yeah, it's living authentically gives us the language of the heart to speak with, truth to power, that language, when we speak firmly, emotionally, firmly, and from a grounded place, that has huge power, huge power. You can't unknow. Sometimes I was the first trans woman that they'd ever met. You can't unknow Nicki Ward. You may not particularly, you might like her, you might think she's funny, you might think she's bright, but you can't unknow Nicki Ward, and therefore you can't make a monster out of trans people, and therefore it's much harder to discriminate. I see yes, you've been very gracious with your time, so thank you for letting me go on here. I'll
No, thank you. Honestly, every word out of your mouth has just been like the comment I said, very authentic and very genuine. Also very inspiring, I will add as well, and also refreshing. It's nice. Sometimes I feel like people think of politicians and you don't see them as somebody who, you think you can have a regular conversation with, because there's a bit of a power imbalance. I make the legislation, you follow the laws, so it's so nice to be able to have these discussions, and you're such a personable person, so it's really nice to be able to talk like this, and also for many constituents to be able to see who their candidates are and what their policies are. And I think it also adds hope into the system now, like well, I should have hope in voting and in politics as well, because I know my candidates, and they're really nice, and they have these good ideas that can help me and things like that. Right. If there are other questions, now is the time to drop them in before we need to end the session. But just to quickly mention, there is a link in the chat for a feedback. So this is just something mainly for me. If you guys, have any suggestions for future events, or any feedback on this event, what you liked, what you didn't like, feel free to give us your input, because it is absolutely valuable to the highest degree. So feel free to do that feedback form if you have the chance, even if you want to open it now and then fill it out later, because once the Zoom ends, the link goes away as well. The other thing is that follow us on social media or websites if you want to know more about Nicki and her platform, or more about ProudPolitics and to know all the different queer candidates running in this municipal election, feel free to go to our website. So it's just proudpolitics.org/candidates. Or if you want to know more about Nicki's policies and platform, it's just www.nickiward.ca. So same with social medias, just feel free to search, the organization name, the candidate name, and you should be able to find us as well. I'm also just going to stop the recording now at this time, but thank you everybody for joining us. This will be on YouTube sometime.